Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Fluin. I'm a developer advocate on the Angular team at Google. When I talk about my role to people, they're often a little bit surprised by what a developer advocate on the Angular team does. The Angular team overall is relatively small, but I really have two missions. My first mission is to help the community build great Angular applications and use Angular to build great apps. My second mission is to listen and understand the challenges that the developers go through on an everyday basis and then reflect those needs within the Angular team. Because only by understanding what's going on in the real world can we really build the right framework and the right platform to make everyone else successful. So I don't know how many of you were listening in the keynote or attending any of the Angular tracks earlier today, but I'm going to start off with a brief introduction to Angular for those of you that may not be familiar. So I like to say that Angular exists to make building applications with the web easy. And so I use these words very carefully because the web is a platform that is one of the most powerful platforms for delivering content and interactivity that has ever existed. But the web is also changing. There's new frameworks coming out all the time. There's new ways of building applications. There's new standards for things like JavaScript and for bundling your applications. And so when we think about Angular, we're thinking, the Angular team is thinking about how do we react to the web as it is today and build a framework that makes your lives a little bit easier and tries to solve some of the problems that you face every day by being a little bit more opinionated. And so one example of that opinionation that we see is that we believe applications should be written to live everywhere. And so when we think about building an application, we want you to be able to use the same code to build your web application that might be rendering on a desktop, or as we think about the majority of use cases, rendering out to mobile devices. And so this means things like performance are very, very important to us. And it also means that things like taking advantage of the latest and greatest of the web, such as progressive web applications, is also a very important part that we feel is critical to our strategy of helping you connect to users and deliver great experiences. I'm going to talk through this in about 4 different parts. So hopefully you guys have some background on progressive web applications, because I'm going to assume that most of you have heard about some of these concepts before, and I'm going to talk about them and how they specifically apply to Angular. So I'm going to start off talking about app shells. Then I'm going to move into service workers and how to register service workers. And then I'm going to talk about how Angular tries to encapsulate push notifications. And then together, hopefully with a little bit of luck, we're going to do some live coding, and we will build an Angular application from scratch. And then we will add a service worker to it to give it some additional capabilities and really try and take it out of the realm of web application into kind of this progressive web application concept. I will say, as a little bit of a preface, that from the Angular team's perspective, these things are experimental. So while we have a lot of great working code examples, and there are companies using all of these concepts in production today, we are still aware that the developer experience can be improved, and we're spending a lot of time and energy on making that experience better for everyone here. An example of that I'm going to demonstrate a little bit is the use of what we call the Angular CLI, which is a command line environment that helps you both scaffold out new applications, but it also helps you to run these applications so that you're getting this live development editing environment. But then also helps you ship great applications in terms of delivering production-ready, minified, compiled JavaScript bundles out to the users in the best way possible with a service worker, ideally. And so I'm going to show you tools that work today and that will work, but you can also expect over the coming months to see all of these tools get baked into our standard set of tools. Because when I think about progressive web applications, I see a future where every web application should be a progressive web application. There's almost pretty soon going to be very little or no excuse of why you wouldn't want to do this, because in every case, the only impact that your additional things like a service worker are going to have are to improve the experience for your users and deliver better outcomes for you as a developer. So let's get into the first section here, app shell generation. So just a brief highlight of what we believe an app shell is. An app shell is a set of static HTML that is rendered on the server side and delivered down to the user to give you the quickest, fastest time to first paint and time to first interactivity. And so many frameworks do these things in different ways, but the primary way that Angular thinks about doing this is with a project that we have called Angular Universal. And so Angular Universal is a project, it's an open source project, as with all of Angular, that is designed to allow you to run Angular applications and render them fully server-side, and then deliver down to the browser a fully rendered HTML document that then bootstraps Angular on top of it, trying to balance both the high performance and ready availability of that HTML, but then also the interactivity and the same development experience that you have with any normal Angular application. And so if you're looking at Angular, and we actually, in the Angular track earlier today, we actually heard from a couple of companies in China that are using Angular Universal today to deliver these types of experiences. So that was really great to hear. So when we think about Angular Universal, what we're doing is we've got a decoupled DOM model. And so what that means is when you build an Angular application, all of the logic, all of the change detection that happens within your application is not happening on a DOM level. We first acknowledge the kind of more pure concept of your component hierarchy, and then we figure out what changes have happened within your component hierarchy, and then we propagate only those changes back using a renderer out to the DOM. So we don't use a virtual DOM. We do it all in the pure kind of ES6 class and module world. And what that allows us to do is that allows us to run, similar to many frameworks, the entire application in the server and then ship it down. But the other thing that we can do is because we're running Angular fully on the server, is we can apply Angular logic to some of the things that you're building your applications with. So this is an example of an app shell module. And so you're going to see a few things here. At the top, you're going to see the app shell module that we're importing from the Angular project. And then we're going to be importing that into our specific module. So you see here we've got this app module, and it is importing the app shell module. So what that does is that gives us a set of directives and capabilities to render Angular in different ways, depending on the type of environment we are in. And so this sets the stage for us, and then we move that forward into a set of directives. And I'll make this bigger in a second. So this is a standard, relatively simple template. So we've got a header section, and once we're writing this in HTML, so we're anticipating being rendered to the DOM at some point here. You've got normal Angular style event handlers, such as these click handlers. Then I've got a main section where I want to render out, for example, these subcomponents called weather cards. And then I have a loading bar, and then I've got a city picker at the bottom. And so what you're going to notice here is in this middle section, we actually have two very intentionally designed directives. So you're going to see star shell no render here and star shell render. And what this allows us to do is because with Angular Universal you're rendering on the server side, we can actually determine which parts of your template should be rendered as part of that app shell and shipped down to the browser, and which parts should not. And so in this case, shell no render means do not render this if we are in an app shell, and shell render means that do render it if we're in an app shell. And so what this looks like is we will not see that shell no render component, but we will see the loading bar here. And then we have any of the other HTML that we put, which is going to be there in either case. And so what we've actually done using Angular Universal here is we've figured out, based on the directives that you've set on your templates, regardless of what routing you're using or how complex your application is, we figured out what are the critical path DOM tree and the CSS required for those components, and we've included those into the app shell that we then render and ship down to the browser. And so this When I first heard about this, this sounds a little bit magic, but many people already maintain their own app shells by hand, and so this is just a little bit of a tool to help manage those sorts of things and to make our lives as developers just a little bit easier. So second, I want to talk about one of the most important parts of building a progressive web application, and that's the usage of its service worker. So just like any application that you're building with the web, you're going to want to check to see if a service worker is available within the current browser that the user is using. And then we are going to register this. But we're going to register this thing called worker-basic. And so what I'm going to demo in a little bit is the way that we generate that worker-basic for you in a way that is going to, we hope, automatically figure out what's in your application and how it needs to be rendered, how it needs to be cached for your users. So we're trying to keep this step as simple and as standard as possible, and then we're trying to do a little bit of the magic on the back end in the same way that SW Precache does for generic kind of non-framework applications in a very Angular-specific context. One of the things behind the scenes that allows us to generate that service worker basic is this idea that we have an Angular service worker manifest. And so one of the fantastic parts of building a single page application is that we can use this idea of HTML5 push state. So this is the idea that I can have a single page application where all of my JavaScript is loading in one place, and then using URLs to map into that state, I can change what the user is viewing. And so one of the things that our service worker manifest does right now is it tells the service worker which routes it should listen for and intercept. So if anyone has built a single page application using and deployed that onto Heroku or Firebase or any of these kind of content platforms, one of the things you had to do is you had to intercept any slash or index.html URLs and serve up the right page. And so what this allows us to do is this allows us to do the same thing within the service worker. And so this is an example of an area that we're trying to make the tooling much better, because right now, this file will work for your basic routes, so your slash route, but we feel that we should be automatically generating or automatically interpreting this file for you based on the routes of your application. Because we have this statically analyzable set of routes within your application typically, and so we should be able to figure out for you what the routes are and then automatically intercept those in the service worker for you. The second step here in having a service worker within an Angular application today is we have a very simple gulp task that we've provided. So once again, we're working to embed this into our CLI, but we also want to make sure that we're doing it in the right way and not limiting these sorts of capabilities to only those that are using the CLI, because we understand that a lot of Angular developers are not yet using the CLI. But basically, what this gulp task does is it will process all of the static files that match a specific type within your application. So you can specify file names or file types, and then we will automatically add that to the service worker cache. And so then when you saw this in the last session, when you look at the application and see what your browser is actually storing, you'll see that we automatically update those caches as soon as a new service worker manifest or service worker has been deployed. One of the things that we are working on as well is the idea of dynamic content caching. So what we would like to do is every time your Angular application encounters a URL that it has to load from the internet, we want to give you the options to look at the headers of that and obey their caching policy, but then use the service worker to do that level of dynamic content caching. So to visualize that further, if you build an application that pulls a data set from a JSON web server or backend, we would like to give you the power and the ability to monitor that request and funnel that request through the service worker, and then if you choose to, cache that request automatically. So this is something that if you follow the @Angular/Angular changelog or any of our release announcements, you'll see very soon. And then the final section here that I want to talk about is the idea of push notifications. So for those of you that may be less familiar with Angular, we are big fans of the concepts of RxJS, and so which is basically observables or streams of information. And so as you might expect, we've represented a lot of push notifications and some of those capabilities as observables. And so, I have a slide at the end that shows you a working demonstration with push notifications in this way that I'm talking about here. But very similar to our app shell module, we're going to pull in our service worker module, which is, we're going to use dependency injection to add to our app component. And then we're going to call that service, that ng service worker, we're going to say register me for push. And then what you'll get back is you'll get back a ng service worker dot push object. And so this is going to be an observable of messages. And because it's an observable, that means you can subscribe to that, you can merge it with other data sources, or you can do any sort of reactive programming that you want to go a little bit beyond just showing this as a notification at the top of the screen. And so we're working very hard to give you control of what goes on. So for example, if your application is offline, so the user is not interacting with it, so to say, then obviously it's going to just come in as a notification. But if your user is interacting with your application at the time a push notification comes in, we want to give you that as a different type of message, and then possibly give you a different channel for how to deal with that message. And so if we look at what it would actually look like in an app component to use these things, I would first pull in the ng service worker via dependency injection. I would double check to make sure that service worker exists within the browser that I'm running in. And then I would register for push as part of the constructor, so as a part of setting up the application for the first time. And then I would take, and I would then also be able to scan or listen to that observable, and then I can push that out into a new array. So scan is an operator on an observable that stacks up all of the things that have come before it. So every time a new push notification comes in, this messages array would contain all of the messages received to date, for example. So with that brief intro out of the way, what I want to do is I want to actually get into a live application with you, build it from scratch, pull in some data via the web, add material design, get it something that looks okay and functions well, and then I want to go ahead and use these tools that I've talked about and add a service worker on top of that. So let's dive in. Just got to set up my microphone here. All right, can you guys hear me like this? This is a jerry-rigged little device. All right, so the first thing I need is a brand new Angular application. And because I'm not assuming any network connectivity right now, I took a moment before we started here, and I basically typed two commands. I typed ng new gdd, which creates a new project called gdd, and then it automatically went ahead and installed all of the npm or dependencies that this application would need to run. So I did the network intensive part before coming, but if we look at this, we're actually going to see a very blank starter Angular application. So I'm going to spin up a server here by typing ng-serve. And then what we should be able to do is we should be able to open the source code, and I'll give you a brief look. So we're doing a demo for GDD. So for those of you that haven't used the CLI before, the CLI's scaffolding capabilities are very powerful in terms of the way that it's going to give you all of the complex parts of web development now. So all of the testing infrastructure, all the testing configuration, the git ignores, because we're big fans of TypeScript, it's going to give you all of the TypeScript configurations for you. And it will even make the first commit for you if you want it to do so. And then if we move up a layer into source/app, we're going to see the core of what is our Angular application. So at the top level, we have a module that was generated for us, and it pulls in some things that people commonly need, such as forms and such as HTTP for making network requests. And then it's bootstrapping to this initial app component. And so that app component is where we put most of our functionality. And so we'll see here, it's a ES6 class with a decorator on it telling it how what HTML to use for its template, what CSS to use, and then how to bind into the DOM. So let's change this here. So let's build an application about things to do in China. All right, so if we save that here, and if our terminal was successful in the background here, we should be able to go to our localhost server and see a working Angular application with that title. And so one of the first things that I always do when I am touching a new application is I actually add material design, because this is a very easy way to go from having a design that does not look very good, which is typically my designs, and then add something that tries to use the best of what Google is designing in terms of material design. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import from Angular/material, and I'm going to import the material module. Don't worry about taking pictures. All of this code will be on GitHub after the presentation. So I'm going to add here a material module. And I'm going to say for root, because we're calling it in a root component. And then now that I have material design, I need to add a theme for it. So I've just got a tiny bit of snippet of CSS here that I'm going to paste in. This basically resets the margins, gives me a little bit of padding on buttons and on cards, and then pulls in that theme as we talked about. And so now let's also take advantage of that material design that we've just imported. So I'm going to go to my HTML, and instead of having a simple H1 tag, I'm going to add an MD toolbar, and I'm going to give it a color matching the primary color of our theme. MD toolbar, just close out the MD toolbar tag here. So what we've done is this color refers to the primary color that was imported from our theme. And then MD toolbar is a material design toolbar that looks a little bit better than just a standard H1. So now, at the top of our screen, we have this relatively nice looking things to do in China app introduction. So from there, what I want to do is I actually want to pull in a couple things that would normally be pulled from the internet. So namely, a list of things to do in China and some images that correspond with them. So let's go ahead and copy those things. So I'm going to go into our source/assets folder, and I'm going to copy from, I think, yeah, so star.jpg. We'll just copy all of the images, and then I will copy our China Places JSON file. All right. So those things would typically be hosted on the web, but I'm trying to do this in an entirely localized way. But now we've got a JSON file that's going to be served via the internet, and so I need to pull that JSON file into my application. And so what I can do is I can use that HTTP module that we talked about a little bit earlier. So I'm going to pull in HTTP from Angular HTTP. And then in our constructor, whoops, I'm going to use dependency injection to get a handle on that HTTP service. And then once I have that, I can define a local variable, such as places, or a member variable on our component. And then I will go ahead and add, or I will retrieve that set of places. So I'll say this.places equals http.get, and it's going to be in assets slash, what did we call it? I think it was China-places.json. And then we'll just want to throw a quick map on here to get the JSON of the response. All right, so now we should theoretically have a list of places that is observable, emitting that list as soon as the HTTP request is completed. But now we actually want to go ahead and render that list. So let's go ahead into our app component, and let's first just throw a div on here. And I'm going to use what we call a structural directive called ng4. And I'll say let place of places. And I'm going to turn or automatically deasync this request. And then let's say place.name. All right, so if I've done this correctly, what we should be getting is a HTTP request gets made to China-places.json. And then that should be iterated over asynchronously and then be rendered out to the page. So let's take a look. All right, we now have a very simple list of things that we can do in China. But let's go ahead and make this a little bit prettier, because once again, you should not trust my design. So I'm going to use something called an MD card. And I'm going to put this into an MD card header. And then we'll say MD card content, and we'll put the place.description. And we'll just complete the tag here. All right, so now we're going to be using a material design card instead of a simple div file. All right, so now this looks a little bit better, but I think we can do even one better. So here I'm going to use an image tag, and I'm going to use a material design directive called MD card image. And I'm going to bind the source attribute to our assets folder plus the place.image URL. And what this directive should do is it should make everything render nice and full, and we should be seeing that nice picture. So effectively, that is our application. So it now works. It should be render relatively well on mobile if we consider a normal-looking device. And so now let's try turning this into more of an advanced web application. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull in a very basic manifest file. So I'm going to once again copy from my little magic folder here a manifest. So if we look at what I just pulled in, this is a GDD Things to See in China app, and I've supplied an icon, I've supplied some colors for it as well. But we also have to reference that, so I've got a little snippet here, so we can pull that into our HTML. Excuse me. And so I'm just going to put it next to this other link here. All right, so there are a couple other dependencies now that we want to get a little bit more advanced and do things like adding a service worker. So there's an Angular/service worker project that I've already added to our project here. So if you see Angular/service worker, I've already used NPM to add that, as well as dependencies such as gulp. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy a very generic gulp task and a service worker configuration into our project again. So we're going to copy the gulp file, and we're going to copy the NGSW manifest. So just like I showed you earlier in the slides, we're only going to intercept the slash, so we're not going to intercept any other special routes and override them. And we're going to see a relatively simple gulp file where we want to look for any HTML, CSS, JavaScript, SVGs, JSON files, JPEGs. So just a list of standard files that might be in our application. And then last, what we need to do is we need to make sure that our service worker is registered on our page. So we're going to, again, modify the index.html file. And right before the end of the head, I'm going to include our script defer, where we check if there's a service worker, and then we register using that. All right, so we've done a few extra steps here and copied some very boilerplate code. Once again, these are things that we want to help automate for you, but they're relatively simple to do. So let's go ahead now and take this out of live development mode. And what I actually want to do is I want to do a full production build. So I'm going to, again, use the command line. And I'm going to say ng build AOT prod. And I'm going to call my gulp task called enhance. And so what this is going to do is this is going to take my code. It's going to compile all of the templates, all of the CSS down into JavaScript, into what we call ng factories. It's going to minify the code, pull out any comments. It's going to do a little bit of uglifying, a little bit of tree shaking, store that entire application into the /dist folder, and then render out the service worker based on the files as they were then. So the Angular CLI is finished, and our GDDs, or our gulp task is finished. So let's check our dist folder, and let's actually go ahead and serve this. So I'm going to use Python just because I find that Python is on every computer I ever touch. And I'm just going to use a simple HTTP server. So now when I access localhost 8000, we should see the same application. But if we look in the developer tools, we should now see that we've registered a service worker. And that service worker should be doing all of the caching for us, pulling in these images, pulling in the JSON file that we were pulling. And then, for example, if I want to take this application offline, so now I want to actually go out into China where I may not have an internet connection, and I want to still be able to pull up all of this content, and I do a refresh, it should still be there. So the entire application is now running offline, stored on my device, and because we have that nice web app manifest, we're going to get all of the appropriate lightning scores. I think this app gets about a 77, if I remember correctly. And there's more that you can do to optimize it, but it's very, very easy to get started. So that was our application. Let me just jump back to the slides here. So all of today's code, it's not there yet, but it will be in my GitHub repo there, 2016 PWA Beijing. And then if you want to see all of the more advanced features such as app shell generation, we have another sample there that you can take a look at. So I will take questions offline, so if you guys want to come up, well, thank you so much for coming. Sure, I can try and take questions now. Should we also do the lightning score and see how we do?
下面是现场的一个提问时间。
你好，我在用 Angular 开发的时候遇到一些问题，比如，有的时候它的数据虽然说数据是双绑定的，但是数据过来的时候，那个页面那个没有刷新。我想问一下，这一般是因为什么原因？
So this is a really specific question about so the question is, even if the data is bounded in Angular, but somehow the page is not refreshed or updated. So the question is wondering if any insight into that.
So the page will what refresh?
It's not updated or refreshed.
So what the service worker basic does is it will proxy requests, and if something is not found in the cache, then it will go out to the internet and try and fetch that for you. But one of the reasons that I'm a big fan personally of observables is that you can actually mix and match data sources. So for example, in several applications that I've seen built, you can combine a observable stream coming from an HTTP request that may or may not be cached locally with perhaps local storage, which should be in memory, but might be faster than a local service worker request, with a full web request out to a third-party service. So observables and the ability to merge observables into a single kind of event emitter or single subject is one of the most powerful things, and that would be one way to achieve this idea of combining the local cached version and with an attempt to get something fresher.
Hi, I have one question. And the PWA and Angular.
Could you speak a little bit louder, please?
Oh, okay, sorry. And PWA and Angular can be used Chrome Explorer, and I want to know how it can be used. Android WebView could be support good.
So Angular is going to be identical to any other framework or even pure JavaScript when it comes to browser support. So we're going to I love the idea of progressively enhanced applications because you can add a service worker to an application, and if service workers are available in that context, so I know more and more Android web views are kind of being served by Chrome instead of Android. I think that's a legacy that's slowly fading, but it's not an Angular-specific problem.
How about PWA? PWA in Android WebView.
In Android WebView,
Oh, yeah.
do you guys know what version? I think it works. I always use caniuse.com or is service worker ready are two resources that you can see. So Angular is not going to get in the way or help in any way. If PWAs work in Android WebView, which I believe they do in 4 and above, maybe.
I don't remember the exact.
They may work, they may not. But as more Android devices continue getting updated, things will get better.
Okay, and another question, I have an application use Angular and use Angular with Android web view, but sometimes when I load a URL, this will show the gap in the web view.
Like a
And after
a space or a gap in terms of time.
a very short time, about 1 or 2 seconds, and the date and CSS or JavaScript will be loaded. Yeah.
Sure. So, and that's why an app shell is really important, because that app shell is what should get you, instead of a gap, it should get you something meaningful on the page that tells the user this application is loading. So, for example, in my application, we just had the word loading, which is not a great app shell by any means. But if you could render, for example, the title bar, just a flat image, or excuse me, a flat background, which is one line of CSS, then the user feels like something's coming. And then the faster we can swap that out with actual content, the better, which is why Service Worker is great. Because Service Worker means we don't have to do a full network round trip. We can just get that from local cache and then render it.
Okay, and there don't have any better solution about this.
So the question is, do we have a better solution for the gap?
Because my application is about stock.
So I mean, I think the Chrome team in general is fantastic at focusing on metrics. So we talk about time to first paint and time to interactive, which is, you only make them better by writing kind of better app shells and by writing less JavaScript. So on the Angular side of things, we're working on rendering as little JavaScript as possible, and we have a long way to go there to make it even better than before, and running less JavaScript. But on the HTML side of things, that's going to be a subject of the HTML you're able to craft, and then the device's ability to render it.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to toss one thing in. We just did a little quick searching, and service workers are supported in Chrome WebView, starting in Chrome WebView 40, right? So if you are running a version of Android that has the Chrome WebView and it is version 40 or above, you get the service workers and all the fun stuff that goes along with that.
Build it today, and every day you will hit more users.
Yes.
I have a question about the SEO. As we know, the Angular is a good framework so that we can use the data binding. But a problem is just we have our website, but the Google Spider cannot cache our website because they cannot do anything with our JavaScript. How can we do with the SEO problem?
So this is common to many single-page applications, or really any application that is using JavaScript to run its code. There are a number of different answers. A growing percentage of search engines render JavaScript for you and understand the page perfectly, but there are still browser or search engines that do not. And for those, there are things like server-side rendering, either doing it yourself, where you take control using a project such as Angular Universal to render the page on behalf of your user. There's also services out there that will load your page and then store that and cache that rendered version of your page. So it's a bit of a hybrid approach. So it's going to work in many browser or in many search engines, especially the one I use. And then there are services if you want to continue and take the performance up to the next notch.
Thank you.
I think there's time for maybe one more question. How are we doing?
Hello, just a short one. I saw you mentioning this gulp task, and I thought that Angular 2 is based on Webpack, and I thought we are hopefully going to move away from these kind of things. And now I just saw it. I wasn't sure, is it just related to your project or to Angular 2 in general?
No, so I'll clarify in a couple of ways.
Okay.
Angular 2 is not in any way built on Webpack. We are agnostic of module bundlers. So there are a number of good module bundlers, that have different trade-offs. So in general, we tend to think about Webpack, which we use for the CLI, and so we're big fans of Webpack, but you'll also see a lot of our documentation written for System.js, because it's easier to run System.js in the client side and in different contexts. There's also things like Rollup, which allow you to do more effective tree shaking. And then finally, things like Clojure Compiler, which can do advanced optimizations and probably achieve the best level of tree shaking. So Angular itself is agnostic to how you bundle. And in general, the module bundling and module loading ecosystem is going to undergo significant change over the next 6 to 12 months because there is not yet a web standard for how modules should be loaded. Once that standard is formalized, all of those tools will probably update to comply, and that world will change. So first part, I love all of my bundlers equally. The second part is what I demoed today is a gulp task, but we are working to get it to work as a plugin, and there are code samples online that if you ping me on GitHub, I can help you find, using Webpack today that do the same service worker generation. So we're designing these things independent of the module bundler so that you can use them anywhere.
Okay, thank you very much.
Do you think Angular 2 needs some state management framework like Redux in React? If not, what's the best practice for to manage our model and data?
So we are opinionated about a lot of things, and we try and force you down some paths that improve your developer experience. State management is one that we are less opinionated about. So we have a Redux pattern library called NGRX that allows you to set up all of the reducers and set up all the actions that you want and use that exact same pattern in a very Angular way. You'll see that you can actually use Redux within Angular. So for example, there's a project called Apollo, which is a GraphQL client that uses Redux and exposes all of this content to you transparently within Angular apps. But if you don't want to use NGRX, a lot of what's built into Angular is based on, if you want it to be, one-way immutable data structures. So for example, what I showed here was a observable of places that would come in, and then a component that was unraveling that via the async pipe and showing that. And what would happen, because we're using that one-way immutable data flow, is if that observable emitted a new value, that component would automatically be updated without reinstantiation. So that's kind of this magical world where maybe we're combining data from 3 different sources, right? We're combining it from a memory cache, a disk cache, and a full network request. And then whatever resolves first is going to be shown, and then whatever resolves second is going to be shown second, and then finally that network request is going to finish, and then you'll have the freshest data, and you can propagate that back into the appropriate caches. And so Angular, as I talked about in an Angular track earlier today, is spending a ton of time on making Angular very, very fast and very performant. And so we've built in this idea of immutable data structures into that model, where we don't have to run change detection unless there's a new value.
Oh, thank you.
Hello，我想问个题外话，我最近花了1个月时间，学了 React， 并且用 React Native 去做了一个安卓的应用和一个 Web APP 的应用。我觉得我更喜欢 AngularJS， 但是它好像未来好像没有往这方面发展。你觉得谷歌未来会做这方面的事情吗？
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, he's asking, he did 2 things. One is using Android to develop an app. Another is doing a web app. But he feel like he like Angular, but he's not sure that whether Google is pushing for Angular for the other cases, right? Or like in the future, or maybe you can add more. I didn't.
No, he mentioned like some kind of developer framework I'm not familiar with. React,
React, yeah, he used React.
right? On the native.
So maybe I'll just try and answer the question.
Yeah.
You can tell me if I've misunderstood. So when it comes to bringing great experiences to mobile devices, and in particular Android, I definitely always look to the web first. For the reason being that you still need a web application in most cases, that you can't just ship a native installed application and hit the entire market that you're trying to capture anymore. I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago you could just ship a native application and not have a website, but that's changed. And I thought the numbers this morning in the opening keynote, about 92% of users are using their mobile devices and not necessarily in an installed app mode. That was really telling. But Angular, we do care about this still installed mobile feel. And so there are projects like Ionic or Onsen that give you the ability to ship a web view. And so you get that icon in the App Store using hopefully the same code that you're shipping on the web and shipping with a PWA to get that same experience. But then there's also ways, because of our DOM independence, you can use something like NativeScript and render, instead of to DOM and instead of to HTML, you can render to native UI elements. And when it comes to other frameworks, you have to look at what they're trying to achieve or what they're trying to be. And in particular, Angular is trying to be a full platform for building web applications across the web. In particular, I'm a big fan of Polymer within Google. Polymer is really based around this idea of standardizing on web components, which are an emerging standard that are available in a growing number of browsers. So instead of relying on something like Angular for a component, you can rely on pure HTML in a portable way. And then what Angular is trying to do is, for example, we can use web components as leaf nodes in a component tree and still get all of the nice event binding and property binding as you would get with a normal Angular component.
我回答你的问题没有？如果没有的话，就是说，当然欢迎跟 Steven 在线下可以再交流一下。最后一个问题，William， 你刚才那边是有最后一个问题。The last question.
Maybe this question is very likely that person. And I want to know the Angular is very suitable for SPA, yeah, a single page application. I want to know, can you provide the Android native package or Android native library for Angular? When I use Angular, write some commit, write some coding, I can call Android native view or Android native action.
Yeah,
can you provide?
Yeah, so I think I answered this a little bit before, and I'll just repeat that a little bit. So there are many projects out there that help you build and ship Angular applications as a installed mobile application, which is for Android, where you get that app icon in the store. And so there's things like Ionic, which is entirely built on Angular 1 originally and now on Angular 2. There are things like NativeScript that allow you to render to native UI widgets. But then there's just general projects like Cordova, which are really all about exposing native APIs in the JavaScript world and then allowing you to ship that single page application down as an app.
Maybe Ionic package or Ionic program is not known by Google. Maybe Google company provide another package or another library. This is very official library. Official. Maybe type powerful.
So you're asking, when is Google going to build one of those? What I'll say is Angular has only been successful over the last 7 years because of an ecosystem and because of things that developers like yourselves have been building to make it better. So we do focus and we think about what should we be building. But in general, we talk to the team at Ionic, we talk to the team at Progress relatively often, and we feel like they're doing a great job and there's not really a need that we can fill. So maybe someday we'll build something like that, but we believe there's a lot of companies out there that are doing a great job, and we want to recognize their efforts. All right, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Steven. 接下来的话，我们是有一个12分钟的 break， 然后下一个 talk 也是今天 WebChat 的最后一个 talk 是在5点半，在这个地方。